Hello, I'm Violet Manners, and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans, and experts. Today on Hidden Heritage, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Geoff Heath-Taylor, historian, journalist, consultant, and podcaster. Brought up in Africa and the English countryside, Geoff started his career in media as an in-house writer for Country Life. He has gone on to write extensively for magazines and the national press, including The Telegraph, The Daily Mail, The Spectator, Tatler, and Vanity Fair. He also features frequently as a cultural commentator on television and has his own podcast, the Chettle House podcast. In today's episode, Geoff and I explore his early life and how he became so interested in history, heritage, and architecture. Geoff explains how his passion led him into a career as a journalist and writer. We talk about some of the key challenges facing national heritage today and how we can safeguard it for the future. Geoff also recommends 3 of his favourite destinations in the UK. But first, let's get to know Geoff in his own words. Geoff, thank you so much for joining me on Hidden Heritage, the podcast. Please introduce yourself in your own words to our listeners.
Thanks, Violet. It's really lovely to be here. I'm a great fan of what Hidden Heritage X is doing, and I love this podcast as well. And so my background is very varied. I was, like you mentioned, I was brought up in Africa in my early childhood. My family are from Zimbabwe, and then we moved to England and rebuilt our lives here. And I've always had a fascination with British heritage and history as a result of that. I think for us, we sold our family homes to buy land in Africa, and so I always had sort of a fascination with families who hadn't done that, who still held on to their sort of ancestral piles. That's why country houses for me are so interesting, and also particularly the links between the people who lived in those houses and the architecture and the buildings themselves. You know, I'm a bit of a Renaissance man in that I'm interested in lots of different things. I love art, architecture, music, theatre, sport, everything, which is great, but it means I'm a massive generalist, which is why being a freelance writer suits me. Yeah. Because I can write about society for Tatler, I can write about politics for The Spectator, I can write about country houses for Country Life, which is great fun. And then when I'm not writing, I tutor and I advise family officers, and I do that to supplement my meagre writer's income.
No, amazing. But also because I guess, I mean, just before we sat down and kind of turned on the microphones, you were saying that, you know, your family sort of virtually had to start from scratch again in 1999 when they arrived here in the UK, having been thrown out of Zimbabwe. I mean, is that what sort of also fueled your fascination in, you've just touched on it, but is that also what fueled your fascination in heritage and history? Because I imagine when you kind of present with a blank sheet, quite literally, of a blank canvas to sort of build your life upon, that must sort of ignite and inform, you know, what you want featured in your life and what you ultimately don't, and where you choose to live and how you choose to live. So I'd love to know if that.
I think absolutely, Violet. I think firstly, I had a very idealistic view of England or Britain, because when we moved to England, it was a new place. It was our safe space. It was a place where we could rebuild our lives. So I was very much sort of, I saw Britain through rose-tinted spectacles, and sometimes I still do, especially the past, which is what also made me interested in politics and sort of trying to preserve and uphold our cultural heritage, our national identity, and so forth. I think for me also a sense of aspiration. You know, but we like I said, you know, we had to rebuild our lives from scratch when we moved to England, and I'm a great believer in hard work and aspiration. You know, we're very much a sort of small c conservative aspirational middle class family who believe in hard work and you know, good work ethic to achieve stuff. And actually, you look at all the great country house owners, that the ones who built their houses, it all started off like that. You know, you look at Thomas Cook at Holkham, which is one of the houses I'll talk about later. You know, he was the richest commoner in England when he built Holkham, and he ended up becoming the Earl of Leicester. But you know, he started off as an entrepreneur and a businessman with a really good work ethic. And you know, my family, I'm half Scottish, and my mother's family have that very strong Presbyterian work ethic as well. So I think what I love about country houses for me, and heritage generally, is the beauty, is the history, the beauty, and the aspiration it encourages in us. And I think that's one thing we can talk about later, but the difference between, you know, envy or aspiration. And you can look at our beautiful heritage through either lens.
Yes.
And I'm a great believer in looking at it through the aspirational lens.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, that's easy for me to say that as well, because I grew up in one of these places. But I think I'm forever struck when I drive up the hill to Belvoir at age 30 still. I always am aghast and always in awe of that place. Despite growing up there, I had this kind of weird dissonance with it, where I never fully feel like it's my home. I kind of feel like I respect it like I would respect any number of buildings that either are dotted around London or indeed across the country, because I think it's just such a feat. They're so emblematic of like our unbelievable capability and ability historically to kind of dream a dream and then execute it and manifest it into sort of physical form. And I find it so inspiring.
I mean, what's extraordinary is that we've got all the technologies, yet we do not build as beautifully as we did in the past. You know, the great medieval cathedrals, you know, took years to build to the glory of God. And, you know, you look at the modern churches and buildings that, they're being constructed now. And I do a lecture once a year for a university in Texas on objective beauty in a subjective world, building objectively beautiful buildings, which we just don't do anymore.
No.
It's all about beauty in the eye of the beholder rather than actual objectively beautiful buildings like Belvoir.
Yeah. So interesting. Well, that's really fascinating. And then I guess your love of writing, was that just sort of born and built from school, university time?
I mean, English was my favourite subject at school. I loved writing at school, but my first job was after university was at Country Life magazine as an in-house writer, and it was actually the only job I've ever got literally through a blind application.
Oh, really?
I saw the job advertised in Country Life, but I was that pilot. I was that real nerd who used to spend his pocket money on Country Life when I was a kid.
I love
that. I've had this obsession with country houses since I was like 5 years old.
Amazing.
So your
favourite pages were the ones at the back where you can see all the houses for sale?
No, my favourite pages were the architectural history pages.
Okay. So
not even the houses for sale. It was the in-depth. I mean, I'm
sort of
seriously nerdy.
Of...
learning about pediments and pilasters and Corinthian capitals and all that sort of stuff. That was my bread and butter.
Amazing.
And I bought a copy of Country Life, I remember, and saw the job advert and applied. And over all the other applicants, I got the job.
Got the job. But what I love about your writing is that you can, as you've said, that you can really like speak to so many different audiences by virtue of the way that you can kind of manipulate your tone to be relevant for the spectator, or indeed something as glossy and sort of fluffy as Tatler or the Mail or whatever it might be. Okay, well, that's fascinating insight, Geoff, into your kind of background and your love of history and heritage. But can we just hop on now to your first destination? So what is it, or where is it, and why is it your first and favourite destination?
So I've actually just changed my first destination whilst we were talking.
Really? Because
I've got to choose the house that got me the job at Country Life.
Okay.
I was going to do Castle Howard, which is a magnificent Baroque house in Yorkshire. Brideshead Revisited, one of my favourite novels. John Vanbrugh was the architect. But when I was asked by Mark Hedges, the editor of Country Life, what my favourite house was, I didn't say Castle Howard. I said Castle Ward in Ireland, which is a National Trust property. It's in Northern Ireland, and it's known as the Franken House of Ireland. Franken, like Frankenstein's monster.
I see. Wow.
Because it's two houses stuck together. It's a wonderful love story. And this is why I love the history behind these houses. When I've had low patches in my life, I go to houses and I'm encouraged by the history. To go to Chartwell and walk through the rooms that Winston Churchill made huge deals in during the Second World War is so inspiring. And it sort of elevates your view. But Castle Ward was built by an Earl and Countess. I can't remember what their title was, but he loved classicism and she loved Strawberry Hill Gothic. And they couldn't agree on what to do. So they built this square house, and the facade is Palladian, and the front facade is Palladian, and the rear facade is Strawberry Hill Gothic. And the entire house is split in half. So you go into Castle Ward through these, amazing pillars and pediments, and there's a massive pediment, and there's, Ionic capitals and all these, very
Ionic capitals.
So the tops of columns are capped with a capital, and a capital is what caps the top of a column. And there are traditionally three classical orders. There's Doric, which is the most simple. Then there's Ionic, which is sort of scrolls.
Okay.
And then there's Corinthian capitals, which you see on English Baroque buildings, which are sort of feathers.
Okay.
And are very ostentatious. And And Palladian architecture, just for our listeners, is quite simple, classical Georgian, like you imagine sort of Pemberley or something like that in Pride and Prejudice. Your typical Jane Austen house. So that the facade is classical, and all the rooms in the front half of the house are all typical Georgian classical rooms. So you've got a checkered white and black marble floor, you've got columns and so forth. Then you go through to the second half of the house, and it's all this extraordinary Strawberry Hill Gothic, amazing Rococo plasterwork, OG windows, which are sort of windows that go up into a point in a Gothic style. And it's literally two houses stuck together. And it was this love story of this husband and wife who adored each other, but had totally different tastes in architecture, who built a house of two halves.
So it's kind of, it's like it's sort of like the ultimate compromise, like the ultimate kind of architectural compromise, but it sounds like they complement each other quite nicely, even though you wouldn't expect them to necessarily.
Exactly, yeah.
That's amazing. And so you choose it because of that, because of the fact that
exactly, it was the story behind it, really.
Yeah.
And I love all different types of architecture, so I love both. But Mark had just asked me what my favourite house was, and I said Castle Ward, and I told him what I've just told you. And I got the job at Country Life. So it's thanks to that. And every subsequent job I've had have been through either the connections or the doors that were opened through my time at Country Life. So
wow. Well, because it's such an iconic kind of publication. It's the oldest publication in the country, right?
No, Spectator's older. It's it's been going since the late 19th century.
Okay.
Weekly, which is extraordinary that they churn out that much content every week. And it's the best. It's got the best archive of country houses and lost country houses in the world. And it was I believe it was the only magazine that our late Queen used to read cover to cover every week.
Wow.
Which is quite nice to think that she read some of my articles.
That's so nice to think. And also but I think it also speaks to, I mean, you're such a lover of architecture, and so I'm so excited to have you on the podcast as well, because I think I'm still learning so much about architecture. Like, I know what I visually like, but I think I'm fascinated in learning and understanding more. So I will interject with like little things saying,
please do.
Explain. Fascinating for our listeners to hear about Castle Ward. And I think, so it's in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just south of Belfast.
So let's move on now to the present work that you're doing kind of in this moment right now. I know that it's very varied, and I know that you're a multi-hyphenate in every sense of the word. You called it a generalist earlier, and I prefer multi-hyphenate. That's how I referred to myself so much before Heritage X. But let's move on now to what you're doing and your thoughts on like the challenges faced by heritage more broadly, because they are, I think they're real. I think there's so much to be said for, and it's so interesting that you touched on awe earlier. You mentioned how these places are kind of awe-inspiring and make you think, I think you said level up. But I find it fascinating because Alice Loxton sat in the same seat a couple of weeks ago and said something very similar, and why she spends so much time in sort of historic buildings. And we're actually, we're gonna do a big sort of report later this year on how spending time in these buildings, we're going to scientifically kind of test how being in big spaces like this actually do inspire. Or as a seasoned journalist for publications like The Telegraph and Country Life and others, you're often sort of focusing in on, and with your podcast as well, the Country House podcast, you focus and zoom in on preservation in relation to historic houses, buildings. What are the challenges in your mind that are being faced by historic houses today? I
think there are so many. I think, people forget how hard it was for country houses after the Second World War, with 95% inheritance tax and, the drop in land prices and so forth. I think today, we've got a general election coming up. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. I think the disconnect between the city and the country is a huge issue facing the heritage today. People, London dwellers, city dwellers, do not understand what the countryside is like. I'm not just a champion for country houses. I'm a great champion for the countryside and country pursuits and the country way of life, which country houses were at the heart of. And I think the disconnect between country folk and town folk is a huge problem facing heritage, because the money's often in the towns and they don't really understand the country way of life. And most of our heritage sites are in the country. There are some great heritage sites in towns and cities, but I think that's a big thing. That's such a big part of my personal mission with why we're doing what we're doing. But I think it's getting people to realise the enormous value that still exists, spending time in the country more broadly, but also in these places and spaces. It's about joining the dots to sort of almost resurrect the relevance of these places in people's modern day lives. Yeah. I think also, obviously, it's a huge financial burden, these historic properties, historic, heritage sites, whether it's houses, castles, churches, cathedrals, they all cost an enormous amount to maintain and sort of run. And I'm conscious that for many of them, it's hard to diversify, especially if they're still in the family. So much of the contents and the land was sold off often after the Second World War because of inheritance duties. So I think I remember a saying once, which was, you need 1,000 acres per bedroom for the income from the land to cover the cost of the house.
Wow.
So if you have a 10-bedroom house, you need 10,000 acres. Now, most 10-bedroom houses have a couple of thousand acres, which means they have to diversify. And that's hard because that requires cash injections. If you want to build an opera house and become like Glyndebourne, or if you want to, do a petting zoo or something for children, it's a huge outlay. And then the problem is you do get government grants and private funding, but then the danger is that comes with strings attached.
Yes.
And I think, you look at the political agenda of some people who donate money to these properties and these buildings, especially from the government, that can also impact the long-term health. I think that's the biggest thing, really. The biggest challenge, I think, is maintaining a long-term view. I remember your father saying to me once, Violet, when I met with him, when I interviewed him for an article I was writing, saying that he thinks in terms of generations and centuries. He plants trees in the park that won't grow to their full height for 200 years. And that's why he votes certain ways or does certain things, because he's thinking with that really long-term perspective.
Which is kind of at odds with our current politics. Our politics, the world's politics, everything about our lives.
And everything about our lives is so quick, immediate gratification.
Yeah. Whereas you really do, and ultimately, if we want our country to look kind of as beautiful as I think it still somehow manages to today, against lots of adversity, but we do slightly have to take a longer term view. And I love that quote that you just quoted about Dad. That's one of my favourite quotes of his. On that note, what would be your favourite, or what in your mind is the greatest architectural loss that happened sort of post World War II during the Industrial Revolution?
Almost 2,000 houses were demolished in a 20-year period between the Second World War and the late 1970s. And the turning point, of course, was Sir Roy Strong's great exhibition at the V&A, the destruction of the English country house, which raised awareness of what had been lost.
I didn't know that.
And it really was the turning point in public opinion.
Really? And it was so he put this
Roy
exhibition
Strong
together.
put an exhibition together called The Destruction of the English Country House, and he had pictures of all the houses and before and after pictures of them before they were demolished and after. There are so many. I mean, Hamilton Palace was one of the greatest houses in England, or in Scotland, that was destroyed. It's hard to choose one. I mean, honestly, these days you think of the great houses of England, you think of Belvoir, Blenheim, Castle Howard, whatever. There were houses that were equally as extraordinary, if not more extraordinary,
agree.
Which were demolished. Trentham Hall, and I think for me, actually, what the house which I think is the saddest and actually is still standing is Wentworth Woodhouse.
I knew you were going to,
which was the victim of class war. I've read Black Diamonds. I don't know if you've read it.
Right? Yeah.
Wonderful. And Black Diamonds is a book about Wentworth Woodhouse, which for our listeners was the seat of the Fitzwilliam family in Yorkshire. And at the start of the 20th century, it had, hundreds of footmen. The landlords were incredibly kind to their workers. They owned coal mines, but they were one of the first landlords to stop children going down mines and so forth. And they were really incredible. I met a guy, actually I was shooting in February in Leicestershire, and I met a gamekeeper who was in his 80s, who was still working for the Fitzwilliam family down at the house in Cambridgeshire.
Wow. And
he said that he was the 8th generation of his family to work as a keeper for the Fitzwilliams. And he said that he doesn't want to stop working for them because they've just been the kindest family to him. And it's just a reminder that these families, they're like CEOs of corporations, and they look after their workers and, so forth. But going back to Wentworth Woodhouse, there was a Minister for Mines after the Second World War, Manny Shinwell, who was in Clement Attlee's party, who basically wanted to take down country houses because of the envy that I talked about earlier that people had. And so he did open cast mining right up into the back door of Wentworth Woodhouse, and it destabilised the foundations.
And just for context for our listeners, Wentworth Woodhouse is it 2 times the size of Blenheim Palace or 2 times the size of Buckingham Palace? Sorry.
It's got the front facade is twice the width of Buckingham Palace.
Extraordinary.
I mean, it is, and you'll see it in lots of period dramas, but it is, again, it's a house of 2 halves because they actually had a Baroque house, which is still the one side of the house in red brick with stone dressings. And then when Baroque fell out of favour because it was seen as too European, when the Whigs were in power, the Whig Ascendancy, which was a political party, the Whig Ascendancy
in what period of time is this?
This is in the late 18th century. The Whigs were much more, were quite anti-European and were very much, purist and quite stoic in their approach to politics. And so suddenly, having been very Baroque, it became more fashionable to have Palladian, which is plainer, very grand, but very simple. So
quite traditional.
Quite traditional, traditional classical architecture, like Palladio's villas in Italy.
Yeah.
Lots of columns and pediments. And what you ended up having was this enormous Palladian house stuck on the back of the Baroque house. And it really is an extraordinary house. And an amazing estate. I mean, I think it had 90,000 acres at one point, and it really was. And at the start of the 20th century, it had everything. And by the end of the 20th century, it was empty.
For our listeners, I mean, if you haven't read Black Diamonds, it's so worth reading, because it really speaks to the sort of, I don't know, I just find it staggering. Every time I've been to Wentworth, I find it staggering to think it's somehow managed to survive and still stand, given the size of it, given the scale of it, given how much damage was done to the foundations. And actually now they're doing, the CEO of Wentworth, Sarah, is doing such an incredible job at really sort of taking it into the next, the next sort of 100 years. And they're really having to think laterally about what role it performs in the community for its survival. So it's fascinating. And I guess that kind of dovetails nicely onto one of my favourite quotes that I know you've titled in one of your articles was a Leonardo da Vinci quote, which read as follows: "Beauty perishes in life, but is immortal in art." Can you just explain a little bit about that quote and its significance to you and what it means in your mind? Yeah,
I think for me, what it is, I'm a great believer in the late philosopher Roger Scruton's views on beauty and the philosophy behind beauty.
That being
beauty
what?
Being, there is such a thing as objective beauty, and a subject to what I mentioned this earlier about this lecture I do. So often people these days talk about beauty as in the eye of the beholder. Tracy Emin's, bed is a piece of art, or that famous urinal that was, that was supposedly a piece of art. And actually no one denies that the Sistine Chapel or St Paul's Cathedral are beautiful. When you look at Foster and Rogers, the great modern architects, they both lived in classical houses. They lived in Georgian houses because Georgian houses are objectively beautiful buildings. Mm-hmm. And I'm a great believer that beauty, if subjective beauty is not sustainable, but objective beauty lasts, it's timeless, and therefore it stands the test of time, and it's actually the most sustainable form of art and architecture because it lasts. So I don't think we use this enough in the sort of sustainability debate of building beautiful buildings which are actually much more sustainable in the long term. Barratt homes have a life expectancy of 30, 40 years. And yes, they might have green roofs and solar panels, but a Georgian townhouse that was built 300 years ago and that is still standing is far more sustainable than a Barratt home with its triple glazing. And I think my view is we need to take an objective approach to beauty, whether it's creating art, architecture, music. Subjective tastes come and go, but objective beauty is timeless, like you said. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I quoted that article. I
think it's so true. And you lecture on that, don't you?
I do. Yeah, I lecture once a year for a university in Texas
on that very subject.
On that subject.
Fascinating.
There was a great commission done by the Conservative Party a few years ago, headed up by Roger Scruton, called the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which was tasked with answering the housing crisis by building beautiful architecture. For example, I love this quote: "A beautiful view isn't spoilt by buildings. A beautiful view is spoilt by ugly buildings." If you think about picturesque, the Cotswolds, it looks stunning with its cottages and its churches.
Yeah, because it's so in keeping with the topography. It's so in keeping with the topography, the local vernacular. And so it's not about not building, it's about not building ugly buildings. Mm-hmm. And, if we build a city if we need a city the size of Bath built every year to solve the housing crisis, why not build a city that looks like Bath every year? And that we want to all be in, that we want to all sort of visit and like we all do in Bath. But I guess that kind of comes back to your earlier point about the prism through which we look at life today. And the point being that we all have a tendency, because of the way that life's moved and the pace at which we're expected to respond to emails and respond to everything about life is sort of sped up. But it doesn't need to impact on the lens through which we look at sort of building on our country and our kind of land. And I guess presumably, you created the Country House podcast at the end of last year with your lovely friend Ben. And was that done with a view to kind of try and mobilise, people, young people or a particular subsect of people in your mind behind, what you believe is really important, i.e. objective beauty and the prism through which we look at sort of building and all those kind of things that we've discussed? Or what was the objective?
I think it's turned out that way. That wasn't the objective. I think the objective was literally, I loved talking about country houses and I love the architecture and the history behind them.
Yeah.
I'm lucky that having worked at Country Life and written about these things for 10 years, I know quite a lot about houses.
A crazy bank of mental knowledge on all
and
of this.
So Ben, who's a producer of a number of podcasts, approached us and said, would you like to do this? And it was, we were modelling it less on sort of mobilising people, although it's turned out that we've really tapped into that. But it was more simply educating people on architectural history.
Yeah.
That's really what it was. And it's lovely. I saw a comment on Instagram the other day saying, every time I listen to your podcast, it's like I'm listening to a university lecture, which I don't know if that was a compliment or not, but it's nice because they said, but it was a compliment because they said we learn something every time. And that's what I love. I'm an educationalist as well. Like I said, I tutor on the side to help pay the bills. And, I'm a great believer in education as a means of social mobility and as a means of furthering your own sense of perspective on the world.
Yeah, because of course. That's what I love about podcasting is it's a very digestible, brilliant medium to kind of get quite dense subjects across in a kind of engaging way that's not intimidating. Like I would find it terrifying to walk into an architecture sort of lecture at a great university because I'm still learning. But I think to be able to have access to podcasts like your own, which is free for people to listen to, and you can come away learning, it's just so spoiling. It's so lucky. For you, what's the kind of greatest loss in art? We've touched on the greatest loss in architecture and building, but what would be the greatest loss in art or assault?
A friend of mine who's a Catholic would say it was the Reformation and the stripping back of churches. I'm a Reformed Protestant, so I think that on balance, the Reformation was a good thing. But a lot of great art was destroyed during the Reformation across Europe. But I think for me, the greatest sort of attack on art and loss of art happened during the Second World War, and particularly the extraordinary collections that belonged to Jewish collectors that were taken and sold off by the Nazis. And many other, there's the famous Amber Room from the palace at St. Petersburg, which wasn't taken by the Nazis, looted by the Nazis, but it's still missing. There was a room that the walls were panelled with amber, and it's amber set in leather, gilded leather.
No.
And and no one knows what happened to it. It's lost. It's a mystery.
When was it? It
was lost
during World War II?
No, during the Russian Revolution.
Okay.
So these revolutions, these wars, great things have been lost. There have been fires, of course, and houses that are also great losses. But for me, I watched that film with Helen Mirren and Ryan Reynolds again recently, The Woman in Gold, about the restitution of the Klimt paintings to that Jewish lady in America from the Belvedere in Vienna. And it made you realise, there's this extraordinary scene where they're sitting in their apartment in Vienna and the Nazis come in and they just say, that Holbein, that Stradivarius cello, that Canaletto, they point and they just take them and they all end up in the houses. No one knows what happened to half of them. I think that's the great loss really is the fact that those were people's possessions that were taken off. Fires are tragic, but that's an accident. To have your belongings taken away from you and not returned, I think is just appalling. And that happened. It's happened in so many countries in so many wars. But
yeah. So do you believe that they should be repatriated back to?
I believe in restitution of looted goods in the sense of Nazi loot. I think it needs to always be done on a case by case basis. I used to be opposed to all restitution, but actually, when you think because it's a slippery slope, where do you draw the line? And I know it's a very contentious issue with the British Museum and the Elgin marbles, and I'm opposed to the restitution of the Elgin marbles, for example. But that's because I believe that they would, case by case, you look at that case and you think, well, actually the Elgin marbles would have been destroyed by the Ottomans anyway, and it was only because Lord Elgin rescued them that they are intact. Much of the British Museum most of it ought not to be restituted, but I think it needs to always be done on a case-by-case basis.
I agree. I definitely agree. Thank you, Geoff. That's fascinating. Well, I'd love to hear more about your second recommendation. So what is it and why have you chosen it today to share it with us?
It's so tricky. There are so many houses I like to talk about. Okay, this one's a smaller house and it's one of my favourite houses. It's called Chettle House in Dorset. Yeah. So it's still a private house. It was sold by the family who built it around 8 years ago, and I actually wrote about it in Country Life magazine when it was put on the market. But it was one of my favourite houses for a number of reasons. I first came across it when I was a boy and I saved up to buy a book from Waterstones called Unwrecked England, which was written by Candida Lysaght Green, John Betjeman, the poet's daughter. And it was based on her series of articles in the Oldie magazine about beautiful parts of England. And Chettle House, it's an English Baroque house, so think Blenheim, Castle Howard, but smaller. It's much more compact. It was built by Thomas Archer, who's a very famous English Baroque architect. It's in red brick with stone dressings, so stone around the windows. It's a really warm, friendly, lovely house, and it's got these beautiful curved edges. So it's not square. So the edges of it's rounded.
That's interesting.
Which is really unusual.
I think I've seen pictures of it, definitely.
So it was recently renovated by the family who bought it after I wrote about it in Country Life.
I have seen it.
And Ben Pentreath did the interiors.
Yeah, that's why I've seen it, yeah. It looks stunning.
It is a beautiful house, and I think it's the perfect size. I think it's 8 bedrooms. It's not so grand that you'd ever have to open it to the public.
But very unusual to have rounded corners.
Very unusual to have rounded corners. But the other reason why I loved it was because I'm a great, and this is why I nearly chose a different house nearby to Chettle called St Giles House, which is the Earl of Shaftesbury's house. I'm a great, again, as a great sort of reformed Protestant, I'm a great believer in the great Victorian reformers, the Lord Shaftesbury and William Wilberforce.
Oh, you are, yeah.
And Chettle stood in for William Wilberforce's house in the film Amazing Grace back in 2007.
Didn't know that.
And so I fell in love with the house then when it was still privately owned by the family who built it. So I knew it from Candida Lysaght Green's book. And I remember, actually, it's funny, I know you've got John Goodall, the architectural editor from Country Life, coming on an episode soon. John's a medievalist, and I used to always tell him about these houses I wanted us to write about that were Georgian or Baroque, and sometimes he didn't know about them because he knows everything about medieval history, but he doesn't obviously know every house in the country, neither do I. And I couldn't name all the medieval houses. But I said to John, there's this wonderful house in Dorset called Chettle House, we've got to write about it. And he hadn't heard of it. And of course, 5 years later, it was put on the market in Country Life, and suddenly everyone's talking about it, and it won the Georgian Group Awards, Restoration of the Year.
Did it really well.
It's been in all the magazines, but it is an extraordinary house. But yeah, so it stood in for William Wilberforce's house, and that's the thing I love is the history behind these houses. And St Giles House is the other one in Dorset, which is the Earl of Shaftesbury's house, because the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury was a great reformer as well.
Okay.
He passed a lot of laws to support the poorest. He's known as the poor man's Earl.
Because?
He stopped children going down mines and up chimneys. He introduced all sorts of policies, poor laws, and introduced the earliest form of state education. He built almshouses and had a soup kitchen in his townhouse on Belgrave Square. Really, really impressive man. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for showing that. That feels like a really personal one as well to you, actually, that you really, really love. So, Geoff, you've got love of both heritage and politics. What would you say the government could be doing to sort of further ensure that our nation's heritage is in good order in the future for future generations?
I think actually one of the biggest threats to heritage is too much government interference. I'm slightly libertarian in my view of, I believe in the small government, let people get on with their lives as much as possible. And I think actually government interference, whether it is taxation or placing former government ministers on heritage committees, I think can be really bad, because if heritage shouldn't be driven by a political agenda, heritage should be driven by its own agenda, which is to not just uphold and preserve, but enhance our heritage for future generations. And I am a great critic of identity politics. I believe that identity politics is divisive. And I believe that we need a form of national identity to unite everyone under a coherent umbrella. So I think, for example, by identifying as individual things specific to you, it can form huge division in communities. And actually, national identity, I'm a great believer in, because it unites people from all different tribes. If you're first and foremost British, and it doesn't matter if after that you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish, if you're first and foremost British, that brings you together. And I think heritage is such an intrinsic part of our national identity. It is the embodiment, the manifestation of our national identity. The fact that there are buildings that house the Magna Carta, that Parliament, paintings that tell the story, the Bayeux tapestry. I know it's not here, but paintings, artworks that tell us the story of our heritage and our history. And I think it's really important that government doesn't interfere too much with heritage, because I think it can weaponize heritage to further political agendas, as we see, for example, with the National Trust. And I don't want to be too much of a critic of the National Trust, because it does some great work. I remember getting rid of the Chippendale furniture from Ickworth and replacing it with beanbags to make it more accessible. And there's that house in the Midlands that's the party house with disco balls. And that's not upholding our heritage or educating people. Mm-hmm. It's simply turning our buildings into another, playroom for kids. And actually, and also them, I remember at Felbrigg Hall in Norfolk, them forcing their volunteers to wear rainbow lanyards. Now, these are volunteers who out of their own time are spending guiding people around Felbrigg, and they were forced to wear rainbow lanyards against their choice, or they were told they couldn't volunteer. That's not the role of the National Trust. The National Trust's role is to uphold our heritage. And the reason why I'm very critical of the National Trust is because it's run by former government ministers and politicos who are trying to further a political agenda. I mean, there are lots of things the governments can do. The government can give tax breaks to the heritage sector. It can give grants. It can encourage immersive educational experiences in the curriculum, trips to houses and castles and museums and galleries. Yeah. But fundamentally, I think the government should keep their hands off the heritage sector.
I actually do completely agree. I fundamentally believe whether you're drawn to these historic buildings for their kind of architectural beauty or the gardens and the landscapes beauty or the collection, I think there is something in heritage for everyone. I mean, how often can you name a place that has art, history, architecture, landscapes, gardens, adventure playgrounds, amazing restaurants, farm shops, all in a kind of very, very neatly kind of created, beautifully curated space, which is a modern day historic house. And I think that's why I'm so keen, to get young people more acutely aware of what they can take from these places. It's not to say that everyone's going to love the history or the architecture or the way in which a collection is presented to them. And they might feel politically kind of conflicted going into some spaces and being confronted with art that is perhaps signalling to a time gone by where our history was, at odds with today's kind of society. But ultimately, it really is like being in the pages of a history book as opposed to actually reading about them. You're in it. And there's a lot that can be said for that. So I guess, create some form of
coherent national identity.
And also just raise your understanding of the context in which you sit, whether you like that context, it's in the past and it can't be erased, unfortunately. And so it's about making sure that you understand what happened, whether you agree with it or not, it happened. So it's about making peace with that to some degree. And then, in my view, learning from it. Because I think if we learn from the past, Alice Loxton quoted, said the same thing when we had a recording with her. Only by virtue of understanding the past can we ensure that we understand our future a little better. And I think for me, that's the really exciting role that heritage can play in this day and age, because whilst everything else is kind of about the next thing and the kind of, we're all sort of consumers in this day and age. And I think what I love about when you go to historic house, you're no longer a consumer. You are just in a space, and you are, and what you take from that space and how you learn from it, grow from it, is entirely up to you and your understanding of it that you come away with. But it's not for anyone, least of all a historic house, to kind of announce or pronounce any sort of objective or subjective view on the people that are walking around it and taking it all in. But I think that's such a wonderful point that you just made. What would be your message, Geoff, to future generations on why is it important that these places are preserved for future generations? Is it just an educational role that they have in your mind's eye, or is it much more than that?
It's much more than that, Violet. I mean, our heritage is the history of Britain. And it's not just about educating us, it's about inspiring us. It's about seeing the achievements of the past. And, when I go to Chartwell, I sometimes think I could lead Britain through the Second World War or the Third World War.
Yeah.
Because I'm inspired by Churchill and I look for the similarities, not the differences.
Yes.
You go to these houses and they are run like mini kingdoms. They're little fiefdoms, but then, it's a kingdom within our national kingdom. I've talked about this in my podcast before, but, you have, like you mentioned, the farm shop and the adventure playground and all these different aspects within a little economy. And I think it is a little world.
Mum refers to it as the sort of, Mum's always said about, not just Belvoir, but actually all of these historic houses. And I really witnessed it making Duchess, because we would travel around the country to all these places. And what was so interesting is you get to these historic houses that, and I'm specifically referencing independent ones just because I spent more time in them. You realise when you land at these places, they're kind of like the heartbeat of that local area. And they, to your point, they are, the local farmers all supply produce to the farm shop. And it's this kind of unbelievable community that wraps itself around these beautiful buildings and the families that in some instances, the ones that I'm referring to are still in situ. And it's hard to kind of get why that's important if you are a city dweller, perhaps, but it is fundamental for us and to ensure that, there's this sense of kind of community in rural Britain.
It's community and it's continuity. You know, there's that wonderful episode in The Crown when the late Queen goes to visit Queen Mary, her grandmother, who's dying in bed, and she talks about how she needs to engage with popular opinion because the Duke of Edinburgh wanted her to, and Queen Mary says, you know, she talks about the history of Britain, the rod of equity and justice, the Edward the Confessor, and the history of Britain over 1,000 years, and the continuity from William the Conqueror down to the present King Charles. And you think about our heritage, and you have to know where you're coming from if you want to look forward to where you want to go. And, you know, I'm not a believer in us, you know, reverting back to the 18th century. I mean, I wish I had lived in the 18th century, but...
Yeah, I think you could have been born. You definitely could have worked quite well in the 18th century as well.
If I'd been rich, if I'd been poor, I would have hated it. But anyway, you need to know where you're going from. And that's why I don't want to whitewash history. Like you said, you know, I don't want to whitewash the crimes and the bad things of the past, but we can be inspired by the good things. And I think it's important to be proud of our heritage and not ashamed. And I think we live in a self-flagellating culture, which is all about hating the bad bits of the past rather than clinging to the beautiful, the good, the wholesome, the true.
Yeah, because I fundamentally think we can do both. We can be really reflective on what went wrong, desperately wrong in the past, and it was in the past, and it was of a time when it's very, very. I think it's very short-sighted to look at our history through today's prism or lens, because ultimately it was such a different time, and there's so much to be learnt from it, and a lot that we should leave back there. But which we are. But I think I totally agree with you. There's also an enormous amount to be proud of, not least these incredible buildings that pepper the country, that are entirely unique to our little island in large part. So our final recommendation is what we're now going to come to. So I'd love to know, what is your final recommendation for today and why?
The last one is a very personal one to me, and it's Holkham Hall in Norfolk. And the reason why is my family are from Norfolk originally, the Taylors, and we ought to be Taylors. I'm Heath-Taylor because my great granny's brother died in the First World War and had no children. So in order to keep the name going, we double barreled. But we ought to be Taylors, and my ancestor John Taylor in Norfolk so my family are very middle class, but academics and preachers were my ancestors. And John Taylor of Norwich, he was a great dissenter preacher, a sort of, went against. He was a radical, political radical, and he used to host salons with, they were all very educated, but they held salons with philosophers like Bentham and Mill and the Gurneys and Norfolk, and they were all part of the same set. And he was a great Whig politician, local politician. And the great Whig patron in Norfolk was Thomas Cook, first Earl of Leicester, who built Holkham.
Interesting.
And he hosted the Duke of Albemarle and the Duke of Sussex, both members of the royal family, for a Whig dinner. And my sort of fifth or sixth times great-grandfather, John Taylor, wrote a song called The Trumpet of Liberty. It was a poem, but it was put to music, about how Britons shall be free and liberty is the most important thing. He was actually supportive of the French Revolution, which I'm not entirely supportive of.
Okay.
But
that's interesting.
He was a great believer in liberty for the working man,
right?
And for Britons. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, the Whigs were the Liberal Party, but they were the party of the aristocrats. Mm-mm-mm. So all the great aristocrats, it was the gentry who were the Tories. Yeah. The gentry were very, very protectionist and socially conservative. The Whigs were much more liberal. So all the grandest families were progressive and liberal. Ironically, the Whigs were succeeded by the Liberal Party. So it's really interesting. You think today of grand people being conservative, but actually the grandest families were very progressive, and Thomas Cook being one of them, and the royals being others. And yeah, anyway, so my ancestor John Taylor, he sang this poem he'd written, The Trumpet of Liberty, and the Duke of Sussex said, "Oh, play it again, old Mr. Taylor," and so he did. I'm a great believer in liberty. It's one of the big things for me. It's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in politics. I believe that, like I mentioned, with my politics being small government, I believe that people should be free, and free indeed. And so Holkham is a special house for me because I can walk through the rooms where my family walked and be in the same rooms. This is an extraordinary house for our listeners. It's for your listeners, I should say. It's a Palladian house, very austere on the outside.
Yeah, I would.
Very plain on the outside, not grand. I love Baroque. Baroque is my favourite architecture. Holkham is very plain on the outside, but then it's like a treasure box because you go in and it is just completely over the top. You've got green and red silks and Chippendale furniture.
Because I never know which way Holkham points. Is it west? Is it east? I can't remember.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
But I wonder if that slightly impacts on whether, because it's so grand, Holkham, really, fundamentally, as you said, particularly on the inside, and it's enormous. But you're right, it's something about it that doesn't necessarily catch your eye quite as much as maybe other Baroque example.
Architecturally, it's not my favourite house by any stretch, but it's the fact that I can be in the same room as my ancestors were. It's the history, it's the continuity, it's the sense of, having lost everything in Africa, it's that sense of finding roots and finding identity. And going there helps me to find, a bit like going to my grandparents' farm in Cambridgeshire and seeing my relatives buried there. It creates that sense of continuity and tradition, which you must have even more so, because you've got family portraits. So you can to walk through the rooms and see the first Duchess or the second Duchess and think their blood runs in your veins is just so inspiring, isn't it?
It really is. And also, I think that point more broadly, your point more broadly speaks to why I believe, we are so lucky to have our cathedrals, our churches, and they're having their own really challenging time at the moment to sort of sustain and survive. But I think that's why these places are so important, because even though, yes, I can walk through Belvoir and I can look at portraits of, in my case, relatives of mine, but I think I would hope that by virtue of spending time in these historic buildings, I mean, in your instance with Holkham, it's a very direct and personal link, but I hope that it inspires other people to go and inquire into their own past, because everyone can find something from their past that it hopefully inspires them in their future and in their present. And I think that's a really beautiful message that I hope people can take away from spending time in these historic places, because I think there's something about being in these old spaces and places that they're not really old in the case of most of our heritage these days, because there's so much innovation that's going on at them. But invariably, it does give you pause for thought and allows you to just pause and reflect and look backwards. And I think there's something incredibly healthy for us all about spending a bit of time looking backwards, because we're always being asked about what's going on in our future. And actually, sometimes it's quite nice to switch off and look back. And I just don't personally think there's a better place to do it than in these historic places. But thank you for sharing that. That's such an amazing story. Can our listeners find that poem that was put to music? Yes,
they can. The Trumpet of Liberty, it's called, by John Taylor.
Okay, we maybe should link to it or something on
but the funniest thing is the chorus is "Fall Tyrants Fall."
No.
Which I love, yeah. And apparently the Duke of Sussex and Duke of Albemarle joined in with the chorus, singing "Fall Tyrants Fall" in the chorus. I mean, it's hilarious.
God, that's hilarious.
But it's all about freedom, liberty, and history and tradition. And, the story of Britain over the last 800 years is the story of liberty, from the Magna Carta through to the suffragettes. And, it's... The heritage speaks into that so much. So yes, we're so blessed to have so much heritage. It's funny. I walk through Chelsea where I live, and I see townhouses. And if one of those townhouses was in New York, it would be a monument, because it'd be
so true.
300 years old, and yet we have them everywhere. I mean, we're so lucky.
We are so lucky. Well, Geoff, thank you so much for joining me. I'm such an enormous fan of yours, such an enormous fan of the podcast that you've created as well, because I think, as I said earlier, it's very, very lucky and spoiling to be able to have access to something, and frankly, access to your brain, which is enormous and so knowledgeable when it comes to country houses and architecture and the history behind them. And I really love genuinely hearing about your 3 destinations, and I just love that they're also personal to you. So thank you so much, and we'll be following along with all that's to come in the future. So thank you for coming on Hidden Heritage.
Thanks, Violet. Thanks for having me.
You can learn more about Geoff and enjoy some of his brilliant articles on his website, geoffheathtaylor.com, or listen to his very popular podcast series, Country House Podcast.